This is Common Ground. I'm Sonja Wolf, and we're back for episode 2 of the social roots of criminal violence in Mexico with Dr. Karina García Reyes. Last time we talked about the social circumstances of young men from marginalized communities in northern Mexico who ended up working for criminal groups, specifically drug trafficking groups. In this episode, we're going to turn to rehabilitation centers and more broadly, the responses that Mexico as a country can give when it comes to drugs and violence. Welcome back, Karina.
Oh, thank you very much.
So at the beginning, I wanted to talk a little bit about rehabilitation centers, specifically the place where you conducted your research. But before we get a little bit to the place that you were able to visit, there's another idea of rehabilitation centers in Mexico. The word that's being used in Mexico is anexos. Could you perhaps explain a little bit what the idea behind the anexos is and why these places have become controversial?
Well, anexos are rehabilitation centers as well for alcohol and drugs. Some of them are you have to pay for them. Some of them in one way or another they are cheaper, more expensive, different types of, services, so to speak. As far as I know, they're controversial. And as far as I know, I mean through my research, because some of my participants actually went to some of these annexes before ending up in the rehab center where I met them. They're controversial because of the methods they use to help patients to rehabilitate. Some of them include physical abuse, even torture, physical and psychological. So in a nutshell, that's why they're controversial.
The rehabilitation center that you studied, where you were able to spend several months without giving away too much about the location, about the name or the individuals who work there. But could you tell us a little bit about this particular rehabilitation center to give us an idea of the kind of place it is? How can we imagine this kind of rehabilitation center?
Okay, so this rehabilitation center is a Christian or evangelical rehabilitation center. The one I visited is very big. I think it's the biggest in the country because there are different rehabilitation centers across the country. And I think there's one in El Salvador as well. So the one I visited, imagine, it looks like a school. Imagine a school, like a primary school. They have like a canteen. They have the library, they have I don't know what to call it, but they call it auditorio, where they have the services. They have a basketball court. They have a playground for children. There are mostly men that are living there. So we have the men's rooms and women's rooms. They are separated. I would say 80% of the population there are men. And very important is voluntary. And this is something different from an nexus. Sometimes, I don't know if in all cases, but one of the controversial aspects is that they don't let them go. In this particular case, all the residents, that's why they call themselves of this house, because it's more than a rehab center, they call it house. The residents of this house are free to leave whenever they want. Okay. And there are certain rules that they have to follow, otherwise they would be expelled. So this is very much the feeling you get when you get to the rehab center is like you're going to school. The same, and you see it's a very family oriented environment. You see a lot of families there. Some of my participants actually used to live there with their wives and children. And yes, it's from my experience, it is a very friendly, healthy space.
The men who come to this rehabilitation center as residents have had very difficult experiences in their lives, whether it's marginalization, whether it's violence, whether it's drug addiction. What does the rehabilitation encompass in order to help these individuals overcome drug addiction, overcome trauma, give them a new purpose in their lives?
I think you just mentioned something crucial there, which is giving them a purpose. So first of all, something I realized, one of the key, I guess, ingredients for success in this rehab center is that individuals are treated as human beings. And this perhaps seems obvious, but remember that, well, actually, many of my participants were in prison at some point of their lives. And in prison, they suffer from all types of abuse, torture, physical, psychological violence. And also some of them also had experience of being in an annexo. So the experience starts, let's say, positively because they are treated with dignity. Also very important, and I think we have to bear this in mind when it comes to drug addiction or alcohol, like rehabilitation. In some of these cases, it was not the first attempt. It was the second or the third. So they joined this house, then they came out, then they came back. Okay, it's not that easy because what they say is that, as we all know, in this type of rehabilitation process, you need, the individual has to have the desire of following through the process. So what they say in the rehabilitation center, I forgot if it's 3 or 6 months. So they tell them, look, stay here for this period of time, minimum. They allow them to stay there for longer if they want. And once they finish, they can leave. And this rehabilitation process starts with physical treatment, because obviously, when you are detoxing from this drug use, it has some sort of consequences, some sort of side effects. So they deal with that first. Usually they are assigned like a partner that is always there with them to kind of help them through this very difficult process of detox, because, the different ways, when they're in this very difficult process where their bodies are literally suffering from this detox because their body is asking, for substances, they describe this as a very painful process, but they are always with somebody. And they're always they have, I wouldn't call it psychological because they don't like that word, but spiritual company, right? So they have, they are brought together with other individuals in the same circumstances. They pray. The idea they explained to me in this process is that they are not alone. It's kind of motivational. I don't know more details about this stage. All I know is that once they pass this, they feel different in the sense that for the first time, they feel they have been successful at something because they managed to overcome addiction. And because it's a a religious rehab center, at the same time that they were having the physical rehab, they were also having some sort of, as I said, a spiritual guide. And that involved, for example, understanding the trauma they had from childhood, understanding why why they were so violent, how to understand their lives and to start a process of what they call forgiving themselves. So something they all said in the interview is that once you are in a criminal organization, there is an idea that you are already going to hell. This is in a context, as you know, Mexico is a very religious country, in general. So even though in their past they were not religious, they did believe in something, right? So in their minds, they were so bad that there was no point in becoming good, you know what I mean? Because they already deserved hell. So in this sense, once they get to the rehab center, they are told that God has forgiven them and that they deserve another opportunity to find happiness and to find a purpose in life, regardless of what they did in the past. I recognize this is a bit controversial when we talk about justice, but I'm going to leave this for later. But that's the process they follow. Okay, they forgive themselves. They start some sort of therapy, and I have to say they don't like that word either. But from what I saw, it's some sort of group therapy, individual therapy, in which they talk about their past, they talk about their fathers, their mothers, all the things that we discussed before, and they forgive them, the parents. They start this process of healing. So I think that's another crucial key element in the rehabilitation center, which is they actually going to, the specific details in their lives that led them to that led them to that criminal life. So they had this, as I said, therapy, this introspection, is that the word? And again, this process takes a long time. Most of the participants I spoke to, I think they had been in the rehab center for at least 2 years. One of them had been in the rehab center for 9 years. So they decided to stay there. And this is something really important that I think we have to discuss in terms of rehabilitation, both in terms of drugs, but also in terms of a criminal life. He said, this is an everyday choice. Even though we now know that what we did was wrong, even though that now we have the tools we didn't have in the past, we have to recognize that we're still humans, and that if we go out to the world, that's what they say, that the world for them is the world outside the rehab center. We will fall into temptation again. So that's why most of them decided to stay, right? Because, and I think this is crucial, because there's no magic potion for this. You know what I mean? There's, and as a society, we need to be more realistic in our expectations. So, yes, rehabilitation is possible, but again, you need certain conditions, right? And one of those conditions, I think, is some cases or extreme cases, individuals cannot go back to, let's say, a normal life again. However, in this rehabilitation center, I have to say it's like a mini world, so to speak. Because in this rehabilitation center, what they do is they have their own work or their own job. For example, you had one of them was like a hairdresser. He was in charge of, cutting, the new, everybody's hair. Another one was in charge of the electrics, because that was his job before. Like, they have a job, and that's important, because as most of them told me, actually, they never had a proper job. The only thing they knew what to do was crime. So once in the rehab center, they are actually told how to work. And if they don't know anything, they are told, what's the word for officio? Un oficio?
Trade.
A trade. Yeah, thank you. So I found that really good, because when you speak to them, when they're talking about their young life, you can feel how they felt. As I said before, disposable. They felt that they were nothing because they had no education. So I think that that's a crucial element as well. Another one is that they are allowed to be with their families. So once they pass all this process of rehabilitation, wives, children are allowed to visit. In these particular cases, they stayed in the rehab center. That it was a decision. So overall, I would say the key, I believe, in these cases is that they are treated with dignity. There's more than violence to teach individuals. And they actually recognize, it's interesting because they are treated somehow like children. And not, I don't know if this is the right word, but what I mean is if somebody, if they break a rule, there are consequences. So there's punishment is not the word, it's discipline. So the punishment is to do the washing up, which is a lot, by the way, because there are 800 residents in that house. So you do the washing up, you do the toilets, you do, and that's for time, for a month. And they actually have a special T-shirt that says discipline, so everybody can tell, that person broke the rule, a rule. So, but it's not a punishment in any physical, or it doesn't actually mean physical or psychological abuse like in prison. And again, the whole process is or draws on the idea they are individuals who deserve to be respected. And they are convinced every day that they are worth it, which I think is quite important because, again, it's quite difficult. I think it's quite dangerous to live in a society where individuals believe they have nothing to lose. And in these rehab centers, now they have something to lose.
But we stay for a moment with the idea of rehabilitation, because you mentioned that the rehabilitation process, in a sense, has no end, that it involves everyday choices, and also that this particular center is able to receive a very large number of men who have worked for criminal organizations. And perhaps some people have a different idea of rehabilitation. They might think that this, in fact, is a finite process, and that individuals then go out into the real world or the conventional world, where they also necessarily will need to find work. Is this a realistic idea, or how should we be thinking about rehabilitation?
First of all, I think this is a spectrum, right? So in the rehabilitation center, you have men like the ones I have discussed, like my participants, but also individuals who have never been engaged in crime before. They just have drug addiction issues, right? So they have loving families. They used to have a job. So in these particular cases, yes, after drug rehabilitation center, they can go back to, let's say, the normal world, join their families, right? But in the cases like these, I think this is where we have to be flexible, in the sense that clearly, every case will be different, but in general terms, I would say it depends on the severity of the cases. When you listen to what these individuals have been through, both as victims and as perpetrators, and, I'm not a psychologist, obviously, but clearly there are a lot of traumas, there are a lot of psychological harms that, in conversation with colleagues, with psychologists, they told me it's difficult to kind of say, oh, you have rehabilitation for, let's say, 10 years and you're done. No. This is, and as I said before, it's an ongoing process. And for some people, that would mean being in a controlled space like this rehab center for the rest of their lives. Not only in terms of the drugs, but also in terms of the criminal life, in terms of the violent behavior, in terms of whatever crime they used to engage with. And I think this is very sustainable. If we actually, in terms of rehabilitation, we aim for creating spaces as opposed to prisons, and again, this is a controversial thought, I do recognize that. But recognizing that prisons at the moment are working more as a breeding ground for future criminals, and that there are several human rights violations within prisons, I think as a society, again, we really need to think whether we want justice or vengeance. What happens in prisons in Mexico is beyond disgraceful. It's just not, first, not fair for anybody, but also counterproductive. Because when individuals come out of prison, which, by the way, some of my participants said this to me, they were treated so badly, they were very angry against the state, against the government. And that's one of the reasons why they escalated in how violent they were. Because some of them ended up in prison for something, let's say, minor as selling drugs in the street, but they were not violent. But once in prison, they were put together with very violent people. And I'm sure people have heard the stories about this, but the point is, yes, prisons usually serve as a breeding ground, as the schools of crime. I'm not saying that we should substitute prisons for rehabilitation centers, but definitely consider an official rehabilitation option apart from prison for some cases, right? Especially for young offenders that follow these, I would say, scheme of, I know it sounds very obvious, but respecting dignity, respecting human rights, respecting not only their rights and their dignity, but also kind of aiming towards the future, like giving them tools for the future, like education, training, evaluating case by case. Perhaps it's asking too much, but if you ask me, that could be a potential solution.
If compassion and forgiveness are important elements in the rehabilitation process, where does this leave the victims of the violence that is being committed by criminal groups? Because we know that victims and also the family collectives that exist in Mexico that are searching for the disappeared, they are calling for truth and justice. How can we reconcile these two sides?
I'm afraid I don't have the answers on it. I'll be very honest with you, especially now that I'm in a new project working with searching groups, and I can completely see the complexity here. All I can say is that, precisely speaking to mothers specifically, who are looking for the missing children, some of them, not all of them, but some of them will tell you, I don't want anything to happen to those who hurt my children. I just want to know where they are. So I think when it comes to justice, what justice means, I think we should have a more inclusive discussion, a more inclusive conversation with those directly involved. I honestly don't have much to say about that.
In the final part of this episode, if we could step back a little from the research that you conducted and from rehabilitation processes, and look for a moment at the strategy that Mexico has been implementing. We know that there has been what is known as the drug war, or the war against drug trafficking, for many years now. Drugs keep circulating, the violence has increased. There's also a mental health toll in Mexican society. And the question I would like to pose to you is, what do you think, as a Mexican citizen and as a researcher, what do you think has Mexico not done? What should Mexico be doing in order to respond to this challenge of drug trafficking, but also criminal violence? And of course, we cannot forget state violence. But is there anything in the response to these challenges that Mexico should be doing differently?
Definitely. And I think, first of all, is, as everybody says in academia, move away from the militarization process, move away from the so-called war on drugs, which clearly has failed. And there's enough clear evidence in every possible way to demonstrate that the war on drugs is not only not working because there's more supply and there's more demand, and it's been over 50 years of this so-called war on drugs. And that particular aim of reducing demand and reducing supply rate has not been achieved. Simple. But not only that, as we know, in countries like Mexico, violence has significantly increased because of the war on drugs. Precisely. So, first of all, let's move away from that. I'm not saying that the military or that state force should not be used. Definitely, but not in all cases. I think the military and the state force should be used in particular areas where it's needed, but not as an overall strategy. And as I have said before, I think when it comes to prevent crime, especially violent crime, I think we should start from bottom up. And perhaps this could sound a little bit weird when it comes to a question about war on drugs, but I would start by protecting families, in these vulnerable areas that we discussed in the first episode. So protecting single mothers, helping them in every possible way, because a lot of the cases of children who are exposed to violence and abuse is because either their mothers or both parents are away all day. I mean, in let's say regular cases, not in cases like the ones I mentioned. In regular cases with loving families, but very busy families, you have children very exposed to all sorts of violence and abuse because they are alone all day. So I would start by protecting children, protecting families, through policies that address specific needs, like, for example, nurseries funded by the state, quality nurseries, quality childcare, because a lot of these children literally start their lives in the worst possible circumstance. And we cannot ask to, I think as a society, we cannot ask these individuals who are growing up in these circumstances to do something different, because because the state is not providing the necessary help, the assistance, the support for these particular vulnerable groups. So that would be one, and definitely reinforce the childcare services in every possible way. Again, I think that when it comes to violent behavior, when talking to psychologists, I learned that the first 7 years are quite important and very important for the development of our brains and empathy and our behavior. So imagine when those first 7 years, all you know is violence and abuse. So how do we link this to crime and the war on drugs? Well, this links back to my research question. How is this possible? How is it possible that one human being can inflict so much pain to another one? Well, through all of that exposure that we already discussed. So for me, we have to cut that chain. We have to cut that cycle of violence. And to do that, we really need to protect our children. We really need to help parents. We really need to take accountability, not only the government, but also the society. They are part of us, whether we like it or not.
Let's stay with the perpetrators of violence for a moment. The ex-narcos, the men who have worked for criminal groups, will probably by many people be perceived as perpetrators and not as victims. And so the question I would pose to you is, based on your research, do you think it is accurate to think of these men simply as perpetrators, or is there also a way in which they might also be considered victims?
Certainly, it's not going to be the case. And as I will say, we cannot generalize, but in many cases, there's a very blurred line between victims and perpetrators, as I already said. And when we talk about perpetrators, we need to consider that they are not born being perpetrators. We have to ask ourselves, how did they grow up? And where did they grow up? How did we come to this point? So I don't want to say that we should not see perpetrators as perpetrators, because they are. But what I mean here is to see beyond that identity. There are sons, there are brothers, there are fathers. Once they were children that maybe were abused, that were, they were victims of so many types of violence. So in that sense, I think, again, as a society, we need to ask ourselves, because in Mexico, 60% of the population lives in poverty. We already know the types of abuse and exploitation that a lot of children and young people are exposed to. So let's ask ourselves, what can we do to help these new generations, and to see perpetrators as human beings, even though I completely understand that at the point that we are in Mexico is quite difficult. I completely understand. We're angry. We're fed up. But again, if we want to prevent violence, and specifically gruesome violence, we really need to think strategically, if you want to call it that way, but also with more empathy.
If I can invite one concluding thought from you about the perpetrators of violence. In the research you have published, you bring together testimonies of these perpetrators. I think in the Mexican context, this is something quite unusual. Often we hear from the victims, rightly so, but you have decided to bring to us the voices of the perpetrators. Why would you say is it important? Is it necessary to listen also to the perpetrators of violence?
Well, precisely for the same, precisely because we are able to understand where the violence comes from. It is wrong to think that people are being born being evil or violent. As I always say, when doctors want to tackle cancer, they study how cancer, the roots of cancer, in order to tackle, cancer. I see myself as a doctor in that sense. If violence is the cancer that we want to tackle, we really need to understand the roots of that cancer. And we're talking about human beings. We're talking about individuals that, as I said before, and I invite people to read my book and inform themselves. There's so many good documentaries and even movies that actually bring this point to light. To understand how violence is learned and how, again, as a society, we sometimes would close our eyes to that reality. And I think at the point that we are in Mexico, we really need to listen to what they have to say, not only because I believe that it's worth listening to them, they're human beings, but also because I think in their narratives, we can find the seeds, we can find that crucial elements that we're missing in order to come up with more effective strategies, more effective policies to address violence.
Thank you, Karina, for joining me to talk about the social roots of criminal violence in Mexico. This is Common Ground, and I'm Sonja Wolf. Until next time.